The angry man marched over to the north end of his farm carrying a handsaw. As he approached the old maple trees, he dropped to his knees and began to saw through the bottom of each tree. When he severed the trunk, he carefully laid it back on the base so that any passerby would not notice that it was cut. Next, he strolled over to a large peach tree and did the same. He propped the tree up with a few sticks so that if seen from the road or the driveway, it would appear to be in one piece. Cursing loudly, he hurried to the barn where he kept his remaining 5 horses. He reached up on the wall of the barn where he had hidden some baling wire. One by one, he wrapped the wire around the ankles of each horse, so all the animals could do was to stand in the stall and eat from bags that hung from the creaking walls. As he alternately mumbled and swore at the various horses, he roughly tied each animal to the stall posts using the same wire. When they were burned alive the next day, the carcasses of these defenseless creatures were found exactly where they were bound. "Damn bastards," he hissed. He accidentally kicked over a bucket of feed, which he then picked up and threw at the wall. "Bastards!" he screamed. The horses became nervous, but they could do nothing except hop from side to side. Outside the barn, the man gathered up some old pieces from the tractor that were lying in the grass. He brought the junk into the barn and threw it into a pile on the ground. While the pathetic cries of the bound horses emanated from the stables, he went back outside and picked up the branches that fell from the trees and threw them into the same pile. He gathered up all the debris around the yard and brought it to the barn. An old, rusted bicycle that lay in the back of the chicken coop, he tossed it through a barn window. "They never learn. They never learn," he repeated over and over again. As he went behind the tool shed, he loosened his belt and then rebuckled it, pulling it as tight as he could around his waist. Outside the shed, between the chicken coop and the barn, the body of a woman, freshly killed, lay in a wheelbarrow. Her arms and legs dangled from the sides of the cart as her blood flowed down into the grass. Her head, broken in pieces by a series of heavy blows, hung over the front of the cart, her eyes staring blankly into eternity. The man lifted the wheelbarrow and pushed it roughly. "Not sick anymore?" he said to the corpse. He carted the body of his wife behind the shed near some tall bushes, so anyone who might drive by would not notice it. After he parked the hog crate, he entered the shed and took out a 2-foot by 1-foot piece of board that he had been saving. He placed the board on a workbench and, like he had done dozens of times before, sanded one side smooth. When he finished, he took a can of linseed oil from the shelf and carefully poured a tiny amount of the liquid into a rag. He then rubbed the wood gently, letting the white pine absorb the oil. Then he sanded the wood again. He repeated the process several times today, as he had on previous occasions. Only today, it would be a little different. Next, he clamped the plank flat side down onto his workbench. The scowling man reached into a sack and removed a letter stencil. It was the kind that children use in school and homework projects. The stencil contained all the letters of the alphabet, both in upper and lower cases, and a set of numbers from 1 to 10. He bought the stencil for 5 cents at a local store in Bath the week before. Very steadily, he began to trace the letters onto the wood. Using a new pencil, which he sharpened every 3rd letter in order to keep the thickness of the line uniform, he drew the letters of his message on the wood. He measured the distance between the words to ensure it was the same throughout the sign. Once he had the words inscribed on the plank, he used a 1-inch brush and black paint to fill in the outline. Being extra careful not to color over the outlines, he painted all the letters. After waiting the prescribed 1 hour according to directions, he repainted all the letters so none of the grain of the wood showed through. Once or twice, he thought he heard a noise outside the shed that caused him to glance out the window. He saw his wife inside the wheelbarrow, undisturbed, immobile, still dead. The man shrugged his shoulders. "It's too damn bad," he said to no one. A bitterness swept over him, fueled by imagined conflicts and persecutions by people he barely knew. It had long ago poisoned his soul, generating a wave of insane anger whose dimensions knew no bounds. He cursed to himself, smugly, warmed by the knowledge that all the townspeople would soon pay for their sins against him, and pay dearly. A time of reckoning was near, a day when debts would be paid and accounts would be balanced. A day when the world would be made right again, and the name of Andrew Kehoe would be known by all. Images of dead children filled his brain, and he smiled. His name was Andrew Kehoe. He was born in Tecumseh, Michigan on February the 1st, 1872, making him 55 years old in 1927. Andrew was one of 13 children. Kehoe's parents were originally from western New York State. His mother passed away when Andrew was very young. Over time, his father remarried, but Andrew didn't get along with the stepmother, and they often fought. One day, she attempted to light an oil fire in their kitchen. The stove exploded and set her afire, covered with oil. Andrew watched his stepmother burn without trying to help her. After a few minutes, he dumped a bucket of water on her and doused the flames. But the damage was done. She later died. Although Andrew was only 14 years old, neighbors speculated that Andrew had something to do with the malfunction of the stove. He was educated at Tecumseh High School and attended Michigan State College in East Lansing, where he met his future wife, Nellie Price. Later, Andrew moved out west for several years. He spent time in Missouri, where he suffered a severe head injury during a fall in St. Louis in 1911. He was attending an electrical school at the time of the accident. Kehoe drifted in and out of a coma for 2 months. Whether or not this injury contributed to Kehoe's madness will never be known, but head injuries have been known to cause erratic behavior, even after recovery. When Kehoe returned to Michigan, he eventually married Nellie. She came from a rather wealthy family who owned several pieces of property in Clinton Township. Eventually, Andrew and Nellie bought a 185-acre farm from an uncle's estate that was located just outside the village of Bath. Andrew was a strange sort, everyone agreed. He was quick to help people, but also quick to criticize when he didn't get his way. He was an intelligent man and able to articulate his points, but often grew impatient of opposing points of view. Andrew was habitually neat, and his sanitary habits were well known. He often changed his shirt in midday or whenever the slightest hint of dirt appeared on his shirt. Anyone who ever worked with him knew that if Andrew got dirty, he would immediately clean up and emerge from the washroom neat as a pin. He was meticulous in his dress and manner. Andrew liked to tinker with machinery, especially with electricity. He was happiest when he was repairing or adjusting the workings of farm machinery. New ways of doing old chores intrigued him, and he was constantly seeking improvement. But some neighbors reported that Kehoe was cruel to his farm animals and once beat a horse to death. Over time, Kehoe gained a reputation in the town for thriftiness. That trait helped him get elected to the school board in Bath in 1926. On the board, Kehoe campaigned endlessly for lower taxes, which, he claimed, were causing him financial hardship. His creditors tried to work out an agreement with Kehoe, but were unsuccessful. Soon, he stopped paying his mortgage altogether. To complicate matters, his wife Nellie was chronically ill with an undiagnosed illness. She required frequent hospital stays, which depleted the family's savings further. Kehoe envisioned losing his farm and plunging into debt. In his mind, he blamed higher taxes for all his financial woes. He couldn't understand the need for bigger and better schools. He saw many of the town expenditures as wasteful and ill-conceived. But above all, and without respite, without any valid reason or logic, he blamed the Bath Consolidated School for his troubles. In Michigan during this era, elementary and secondary school education in rural areas followed a standard pattern for most people. There were many small, one-room schools scattered across the countryside. Different grades shared the same classroom and the same teacher. There was a widespread belief that the children would receive a better and more complete education if students could attend a single school at one location. The grades could be divided into classes, as it should be, and the facility could be of a higher quality. After years of debate and dedication, the district built a new school, the Bath Consolidated School. Taxes were raised to pay for the project, and as a result, landowners, like Andrew Kehoe, had to foot the bill. Kehoe argued against the school and complained constantly about the increase in taxes. Although he was an intelligent man, Kehoe was intolerant of others' opinions. He was respectful towards other board members, but could be a bitter enemy. He was the type of man who carried a grudge. He complained loudly to anyone who would listen about the increase in taxes that he saw as illegal and unfair. He blamed the board president, Emory E. Hayek, for his influence over the other members. He became obsessed with school board politics, Superintendent Hayek, and the injustice of taxes, which he saw as the ruination of his life. Sometime during the summer of 1926, Kehoe plunged into the depths of insanity. During the winter of 1926, the board appointed Kehoe to perform maintenance in the Bath Consolidated School. Kehoe was a talented handyman and knew his way around electricity. He was mechanically adept and often fixed his neighbors' machinery. As the school handyman, Kehoe had free access to the building. His presence was never questioned. But, unknown to anyone, Kehoe had accumulated over a ton of a high explosive called pyrrolitol in his home. He made periodic purchases of the explosive in different stores in the Lansing area during the previous months. In November of 1926, Kehoe drove to Lansing where he purchased 2 boxes of dynamite at a sporting goods store. Pyrrolitol was a World War I surplus explosive that was used by farmers for excavation and other chores. Kehoe made similar purchases that were recorded and preserved. He couldn't buy the large amount that he needed at one time. It would arouse too much suspicion. So he spread out his purchases over the previous few months, and for those that did take notice, he had an explanation already prepared. He became known in the community as a dynamite farmer. It was routine to hear explosions on his farm. He told his neighbors that he used the dynamite to remove tree stumps and excavate for his crops. By spring of 1927, Kehoe began to transport the pyrrolitol little by little into the Bath school. At home, he calculated what he needed for the day and brought just that amount. He began an extensive wiring program, connecting various charges of explosives, which were concealed in the floors and rafters of the school. Into the subfloors and crawl spaces of the Bath Consolidated School, Kehoe inched his murderous way into the darkness, snaking wire through the rafters and walls, hiding huge amounts of pyrrolitol behind pipes and beams. Working quietly, steadily, with no rest or remorse, he managed to lay thousands of feet of wire throughout the building without being detected. Just beneath the feet of unsuspecting children, most of whom he never knew, Kehoe planted over 1,000 pounds of dynamite. Once the project was completed in early May, he set the charges and waited. As was his custom, he did everything according to a well-thought-out plan of action. During this time, Kehoe also wired up his homestead in the same manner. In every structure on the farm, he rigged a series of firebombs. These crude devices consisted of containers filled with gasoline and wired with automobile spark plugs attached to a car battery. Kehoe knew the device would work because he had already tested it many times on his farm. On May 17th, he drove his pickup truck over to the front of the barn where he began to fill the back seat with all sorts of metal debris. He threw in old tools, nails, pieces of rusted farm machinery, digging shovels, anything that could make shrapnel during an explosion. When the entire back seat was full of this metal junk, Kehoe placed a large cache of dynamite behind the front seat and laid a rifle on the front seat, fully loaded. On this same day, May 17, 1927, in the early afternoon, Kehoe killed Nellie by bashing her skull with some sort of heavy object. How he actually killed her, and with what weapon, will never be known. He dumped her body into a hog cart, which is a type of wheelbarrow, and pushed it over to the rear of the hen house. She lay there, unnoticed and undisturbed, sprawled inside the cart like a rag doll. He then completed the wiring of the farm. In every building, he inserted one of his homemade firebombs. It became a vast fire trap. If everything went as planned, his property would simultaneously explode in flames and surely burn to the ground before help could arrive. The farm would be destroyed. The house, the barn, the trees, horses and chickens, even the fruit on the trees. There would be nothing for Nellie's relatives and the banks. Nothing. A beautiful spring day it was on May 18, 1927, in Bath, Michigan, so very much in contrast with what was about to happen. In the morning, Kehoe made a brief trip to the town post office where he mailed a rather large package containing the finance history of the school board. Also included in the papers was a long and detailed explanation concerning a 22-cent discrepancy in Kehoe's own books. Such was his manner. It was an indication of his insanity that Kehoe would debate a 22-cent shortage when he was minutes away from committing mass murder. At about 8 a.m., The children began to arrive at the Consolidated School for the day's classes, as they had for so many other mornings. They pushed and shoved their way through the hallways, calling to each other, dropping books and pencils onto the floor, hurrying to class, thinking of ways to explain why they couldn't do their homework or pass the end terms, their minds firmly fixed on the summer vacation that loomed just ahead. They had no way of knowing that just inches beneath their feet, over 1,000 pounds of dynamite waited patiently for a tiny electric current to begin an explosive chain reaction that would change their lives forever. At about 8:30 that morning, Mrs. Blanche Hart, a sixth-grade teacher, instructed her pupils in a second-floor classroom. Willa and George Hall, brother and sister, sat in another class opening their books for the day's assignment. Robert Bromund, 12, sat in his fifth grade dreaming of baseball. His sister, Amelia, 11, was in Mrs. Hart's class. Robert Cochran, 9, was in the third grade and recently told his father he wanted to be a doctor. Willa Marie, 11, and her brother George, 9, packed up their books as they prepared for the summer recess. All three of the Nichols sisters, Ruth, Ottilia, and Emma, were attending their final classes of the school term. Stanley Hart, 10, and his brothers and sisters, Robert, Percy, Iola, and Vivian, went about their duties in different classrooms. Miss Eva Gubbins, another sixth-grade teacher, was just sitting down to grade student papers. And Cleo Clayton, 8 years old, gazed out the first-floor window into the fields of grass and meadow where he played many times before, oblivious to a particularly cruel fate to which he would soon be a victim. Meanwhile, about 2 miles from the school, Kehoe had completed final preparations on his farm. At approximately 8:45 a.m., he detonated the firebombs at his home. The entire place exploded into flames, sending debris far into the sky, some of which eventually landed on a farm across the road. The neighbors, hearing the explosion, ran to Kehoe's farm to render assistance. As they sprinted down his driveway, Kehoe was already behind the wheel of his pickup truck. "Boys," he said, "you're my friends. You better get out of here. You better go down to the school." Within minutes, the Kehoe farm was fully engulfed in flames. Neighbors, not knowing what had actually happened, rushed to the scene to help. As Kehoe quickly drove away, another tremendous explosion, much bigger than the first, occurred in the distance. The sound was heard for at least 10 miles. The Bath Consolidated School had been blown up. O.H. Buck, who responded to the Kehoe farm to render aid, heard the massive explosion at the school. "I began to feel as though the world was coming to an end," he later told reporters. In Lansing and East Lansing, the police and fire departments were notified immediately. Before the dust from the school explosion had even hit the ground, townspeople were digging through the rubble. M.J. Ellsworth, Kehoe's next-door neighbor, was one of the first rescuers to arrive. "We could hear the children screaming and moaning at the school. It seemed as if our car would hardly run. It was a ride that none of us will ever forget." When they arrived at the school, they were stunned by what they saw. Fully half the building, the northwest wing, was gone. The walls were destroyed, and the roof lay on the ground. Under it, the bodies of children lay. Little arms and legs stuck out from the ruins. Faces, covered with blood and dust, peered through broken windows and debris. Miss Sterling, a teacher on the second floor, told the press, "Without warning, this terrible explosion came. I saw the bodies of my children hurled against the walls or through the windows." Frantic mothers ran screaming to the scene, for almost every adult in town had at least one child enrolled at the school. The sobbing of trapped children could be heard as some mothers fought with rescuers to pull their children out from the wreckage. The magnitude of the blast was enormous. Those who came to the school imagined and expected the worst. Men worked feverishly digging into the mountain of rubble where little children were screaming in terror. Less than 30 minutes after the school explosion, Kehoe pulled up in his pickup truck. No one knew that he had loaded the back of his vehicle with dynamite and pieces of metal junk. He got out of his car and saw School Superintendent Emery Hayek in the distance. Kehoe called him over to his car. As he approached, Kehoe pulled a rifle from the front seat, aimed at the dynamite, and fired. Another powerful explosion rocked the helpless village. A huge column of flame erupted into the sky and sideways down the street. Shrapnel shot out in all directions, through the trees, windows, and homes, striking down everything in its path. Emery Hayek and Postmaster Glenn Smith were killed. Kehoe was almost obliterated. As Glenn Smith lay dying on the ground, he told rescuers, "Leave me, boys, and run. These trees are full of it," as quoted in Ellsworth, page 10. A few minutes later, he died in his wife's arms. And student Cleo Clayton, 8 years old, still dazed from the first blast and walking along the street 100 yards away, was struck in the stomach by a large bolt from Kehoe's shrapnel. He died some hours later, twice a victim of Kehoe's madness. The people working at the school were in a full panic. No one understood what had happened. Many imagined they were under some sort of military attack. Rumors swept through the crowd about more explosions to come. In the distance, Kehoe's farm continued to burn, sending pillars of thick black smoke hundreds of feet into the air. Periodic explosions could still be heard from the farm as Kehoe's stash of pyrotol continued to detonate. In the village, rows of parked cars, as well as many of the trees along the road to the school, were on fire from the original blast. Pieces of bodies were strewn in the bushes and trees, and many relatives of the children had fainted or become hysterical. 3 of the Hart children, Iola, Vivian, and Percy, were found dead in the rubble. So were Willa and George Hall, Robert and Amelia Bromond, and several dozen others. Over 100 people were injured, and more were being uncovered by the minute. Very shortly after Kehoe's truck explosion, the Lansing Fire and Police Departments arrived from the city. The state police came upon the scene, and the Department of Public Safety also sent their people. But nothing could have prepared the police for what they saw. Wrecked and burned cars, downed trees, a collapsed building containing screaming children, fires everywhere. It resembled some battle scene from a world war. Near the school was the front end of a Ford with parts of a human body hanging on it. Truck parts were found 125 feet in one direction from the machine and 30 feet in another. Flesh dangled from overhanging telephone wires. People were frantic, trying to dig the children out from beneath the ruins with bare hands. A short distance away from where Kehoe's pickup exploded, Mrs. Frank Smith stood in front of her home watching in horror the events that unfolded before her eyes. In the corner of her garden, amidst the flowers and grass she meticulously cared for, she noticed a crumpled mass of clothing. As she investigated, she saw that it was a large part of a human body, bloodied and mangled almost beyond recognition. From a rear pocket of the clothing, she saw some papers and carefully removed them. When Mrs. Smith read the papers, she saw that part of it was a bank book from the Lilly State Bank of Tecumseh, belonging to Andrew Kehoe. The other part was Kehoe's Michigan driver's license. Mrs. Smith ran over to the local sheriff who was directing rescue efforts at the school. The sheriff brought some of Kehoe's neighbors who viewed the human remains in Mrs. Smith's garden, and a positive identification was made. Andrew Kehoe had been found. Back at the school, hundreds of rescuers were working the ruins. As they searched through the rubble, desperate to find signs of life, a chilling discovery was made. The state police emerged from the basement of the school with a bushel of fresh dynamite and informed the crowd there were more explosives in the building. Minutes later, police located a battery and a clock. All rescue efforts came to a sudden halt. Working frantically in the twisted steel and concrete, not knowing if they would be blown to hell the next second, with a courage that speaks volumes of such men, police carefully dismantled the remains of Kehoe's handiwork. Someone asked these men why they risked their lives, and one of the cops replied, "That is our duty," from Ellsworth, page 12. They removed a total of 504 pounds of dynamite, along with wires and detonating devices. The pyrotol was divided up into 8 different bombs, hidden in various spots on the south end of the school. Police theorized the first blast caused some sort of a short circuit and caused a malfunction of the bomb. If this additional dynamite had gone off, the school would have been demolished, and the death toll would surely have been in the hundreds. Slowly, the bodies of the innocent victims were brought out from the ruins. They were placed in neat rows on the grass by the school, where they were hastily covered up. Then, one by one, the corpses were transported to City Hall, which acted as a temporary morgue. Dazed parents, racked by grief and shock, were brought in to identify the remains of the children, some of whom were horribly mangled. A short distance away, Mrs. Eugene Hart sat in the street with her 2 little dead girls, one on each arm, and her son, Perry, lying dead in her lap. "There were sights that I hope no one will ever have to look at again," said M.J. Ellsworth. The following day, Nellie Price Kehoe was found on what remained of the Kehoe farm. Her body was burned almost beyond recognition. Her left arm was broken off and her right leg was missing. Of the cart in which she lay, only the axle and wheels were left. Near the cart, workers found several items of jewelry and valuables strewn about. All the buildings of the farm were destroyed. The horses that Kehoe had tied up were dead, as well as all the other farm animals that he trapped inside the barn. As rescuers searched the property for clues to the devastation, they found the enigmatic wooden sign that Kehoe had wired up to the fence, the sign that he had worked on with his usual obsessive attention, a short message which he imagined could explain his wretched madness to the world. His final words to the families of the dead, as if this sentence could explain it all. The sign read, "Criminals are made, not born." A total of 38 children were killed, 7 teachers died, and 61 others were severely injured. Across the world, newspaper headlines announced the shocking tragedy in the village with the unlikely name of Bath. The story competed for page 1 space with the Charles Lindbergh flight and massive floods on the Mississippi River. The New York Times story of May 19th read, "Maniac blows up school, kills 42, mostly children." The press struggled to find reasons for Kehoe's bombing rampage, but, of course, there were none. In the wake of such a tragedy, there is never an acceptable explanation. The Bath community was devastated. Its loss could not be measured in simple numbers. No one in the village escaped harm. Virtually everyone had lost a relative, friend, classmate, teacher. In addition to the human casualties, Bath faced a financial catastrophe. A new school would have to be built by a town that had already sacrificed a great deal to build the first one. The future looked bleak. Over the next few days, an endless wave of funerals took place in the Bath community. 18 funerals alone were held on Saturday, May 22nd. On Sunday, the very same day that Charles Lindbergh completed his historic flight to Paris, the last of the funerals were held. People from surrounding states descended upon Bath by the thousands. Over 100,000 cars passed through Bath that day, a staggering amount of traffic for such a small town. Some of the citizens of Bath saw this armada of cars as an intrusion into their private grief. Newspaper reporters of the time commented on these thousands of people milling about the town, describing them as heartless curiosity seekers. But most people accepted it as a show of sympathy and support from surrounding communities. A coroner's inquest was held the following week. Responsibility for the blast had to be formally assessed, and although no one had any doubt as to the outcome of the proceedings, everyone knew it was a legal necessity. After several days of emotional testimony by dozens of Bath citizens and law enforcement personnel, a decision was announced. The inquest found that Superintendent Emery Hayek was murdered by Andrew Kehoe on the morning of May 18, 1927. It also announced that the Bath Consolidated School was blown up by Kehoe's deliberate plan, and he, in fact, murdered 45 people, including his wife, Nellie. A judgment of suicide was decided as the cause of Andrew Kehoe's death. His remains were taken to another community, unspecified, where he was buried in an unmarked grave, alone, isolated, just as he was in life. Today, 8 decades after the event, and worlds away from rural 1927 Michigan, the village of Bath still remembers the awful tragedy that nearly destroyed their community. A museum commemorating the history of the Bath School is located nearby. Gene Wilkins, the town historian who has dedicated his life to memorializing the bombing catastrophe, said recently, People of that era had great faith, and that is what got them through that time. If you carry hate for over 80 years, it would have consumed you. We hope their memories live on forever. Citizens from the Bath community have donated many items and memorabilia from the tragedy. An American flag that flew over the school on May 18, 1927, was returned to the museum in 1977 by a firefighter who was at the bombing scene. A statue titled "Girl with a Cat," completed in 1928 by artist Carlton W. Angel, stands inside the museum, a testament to the courage and determination of the people from Bath. The work was financed by penny donations from young students from the state of Michigan. It was rumored for years, and still believed by many, that those pennies were melted down to make the cast for the statue. Whether it's true or not remains a mystery. The Bath Consolidated School has long since been torn down. Another school was built in its place, and that school was eventually torn down also. A small park has been built where the original school once stood. Inside the park, a bronze memorial plaque contains the names of all the children killed on that terrible day. And although their parents survived, they too were victims of the bombing. For life has never been the same since. But it hasn't been easy. The murder of children is never an easy thing. Some people moved away from Bath in the years after the tragedy, probably as much to escape from their own memories as anything else. The episode had a numbing effect on the community that, in a sense, still remains deeply embedded in the subconscious of successive generations. To many people, Bath is still remembered as the place where a bloody school massacre occurred on a glorious spring day. A day when one man's strange obsession was transformed into hate, and hate transformed into murder. A day when the world went wrong, and death fell upon the innocent. A day when hell came to Bath.